Salvation is wholeness and healing. Growing up, growing wise, learning, moving a few steps ahead. That's what we talked about last week. Salvation as a process of wholeness, health, healing, growth. And this process intrinsically involves a liberation. Liberation from the past, from pain, from one's personal demons, from prejudices, from oppression, from injustice, whatever it is. Getting healthy and whole is a process of step-by-step being set free. Jewish tradition, when they get to Passover every year, reminds us that they say every generation must come out of Egypt for itself. And so must every person come out of Egypt for themselves. And this liberation, this escaping Egypt, is difficult. And the chief difficulty involved in it, the thing that makes it the hardest, is we are human. This week on one of my favorite podcasts, Freakonomics, they had a guest, Angela Duckworth, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and she talked about her ongoing project, which is called the Character Lab. It's a multidisciplinary, huge-ranging study about why it is so difficult for human beings to make substantive and lasting change. And she says the biggest problem facing humanity is humanity. Can we possibly get better at making decisions and at changing our behavior and sticking with the changes? Why is it so difficult to not only make a change, a positive change, but to stick with new and better habits? That's what they're investigating. We know it's good to eat healthy food, to exercise, to unplug, to go outside, to make art, to hang out and talk with friends. We know it's bad to overindulge in anything, food and drink and sex and shopping, and yet addictions continue to be a very real plague among us. One of the reasons it is so difficult for human beings to make and stick with positive change is that we are evolutionarily wired to fight or run away. We seek the familiar and what feels safe, even if the change is the thing that would be beneficial and required for our salvation, our liberation, our health and wholeness. We are suspicious. We are fearful of change, even if we know it's a good thing for us to do. And evolutionarily, this probably makes a lot of sense. If we weren't so, a lot more of us would have been lion and bear food. And yet, some of us, at some point, had the guts to mimic the lightning strike by sticking those two rocks together really hard and making fire. And if they hadn't done that, we might not be here. When the Israelites celebrated Passover and liberated themselves from the bondage of slavery in Egypt, the first thing they did after they got out, right? The first thing is they complained about it. They're in slavery. They're like, God, I wish somebody would get us out of slavery. This Pharaoh thing making us make bricks isn't really fun. And so Moses sees this. He gets out. The bush catches on fire. And he gets a sense that whatever happened with that bush, it got into his head the idea, hey, all this stuff going on is not right. And he goes back, and him and Aaron, they get together. And Moses is a stutterer, so he doesn't want to be the spokesperson, but gets talked into it anyway. He brings Aaron with him, right? And they're like, no, Pharaoh, the slavery thing ain't cool. Let our people go. And Pharaoh does what most people in positions of institutional power do. Tells them to get lost. So they come at him with everything. The locusts, the frogs, the fire, the death of everything firstborn. I mean, this is Stephen King, right? And they go through all this, and they get out of Egypt, and they're running away, and they get to this big place of water, and they're stuck, and the army's chasing them, and they're going to get caught. And this is where, God comes in and the waters, Charlton Heston raises the staff, and the water split, and they escape, and they're out there, and they're free. And the second night they're out there, hey, we're hungry and cold. We want to go back to Egypt. Can you imagine Moses and Aaron? They're like, what? Are you people serious? Well, at least when we were slaves in Egypt, we had some bread. And Moses and Aaron are like, give me a break. Really? So, they get a little help. The manna comes down from heaven, meat's provided, it all works out. You have to suspend the disbelief a little bit like in the movie, right? But the story works out at that point. But their first reaction, once they get free, their very first reaction is, I don't like it here, let's go back. Back to Pharaoh. We want to go back to Pharaoh. The back to Pharaoh syndrome. This has been a theme ever since this story was first told. Okay, we're wandering around in the desert, we're no longer slaves. But, God, we're cold and hungry. It's hard out here making our own way and doing everything for ourselves. It's really different than what we had before, even if we were slaves before. And then they lay this on Moses and Aaron. You guys are trying to kill us. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came to the wilderness of Sin. Great dramatic name, right? The wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly of us with hunger. Can you imagine Moses and Aaron? How ticked off would you be if you were them, right? You'd be like, come on, seriously? We're trying to kill you? Freedom, wholeness, healing, liberation, salvation. It requires facing the uncertain, the unknown. It requires wandering around in the desert, lost and thirsty and hungry, and not really knowing which way you're going for a while. It is certainly not for the faint of heart. It requires a leap of faith. And faith, as I always define it, is trust. It requires a leap of trust. Trust that the liberation, the salvation, the holding, the healness is worth it. It's worth the struggle and the pain and the adjustment. And it requires trust of the others on the journey that they have your back. And that you are not in this alone. There comes a time when the initial idea to change, the inspiration and motivation for the change, runs up against the idea and reality of the desert. Individuals and groups realize, wow, this is much harder than I thought it was going to be. And so we're back to the study at the University of Pennsylvania. So how do we get people to keep going with something they know is good for them? Because it's so difficult when you hit that desert. You eat right for a few days, you made it to the gym, and then that Saturday morning comes and you're like, I'm having pancakes and syrup, and I'm just sleeping in today. We give up and run back to the safety of Pharaoh, where, although we were slaves, at least we had some bread. The way we've always known it becomes a port of safety in the storm of our own liberation and salvation, wholeness, and healing. Our society is going through this right now. Our whole American culture, social and political and economic, is in a massive back to Pharaoh reaction. All the progress we have made in terms of social inclusion, diversity, tolerance, acceptance, inclusion, fairness, so many people are terrified of that progress. Terrified, and they're angry, and they want to go back to Pharaoh. They want to go back to Egypt, where women and blacks and Jews and Muslims and poor people and those Mexicans and gays knew their place. It was safe for us then. Our society cannot reach a place of safety and wholeness and growth on health care and public higher education as a right and not a privilege of the rich. Nor can we seem to get to a living wage or pay women the same amount for the same work as they do as men, because it's easier to go back to Pharaoh than do the hard work of pushing through, traveling through the desert, doing the liberating and salvific growth and healing that would come at the end of the journey. It's hard. I mean, we see it around us now. How do we keep up with the constant things we're being called to do? The protests, the right this Congress, the raids going here, the crazy executive orders there. There's a whole lot of action coming at us. And the people behind that, they think it's a good idea. They want to go back to Pharaoh, to the good old days. And then there's the rest of us. We're getting weary of the struggle against pushing it forward. We want to go back to Pharaoh. Can't we just go back to like the 60s and hang out and listen to cool music? This is tiring. So we're both in that place. We get in it personally. We get in it as groups like a congregation. We get in it as a whole culture. Going back to Pharaoh is easy. Pressing on is difficult and requires a leap of faith. Our denomination is going through it right now. For all our talk about racial diversity and inclusion and equality of women in the LGBTQ community, we are getting called out for consistently having top leadership that is white, straight, and male. And now we're getting called out by our own people of color who we've invited in, saying we're going to practice this inclusion stuff, and they're hitting the glass ceiling. And they're saying we're going to smash this glass ceiling down. And all of a sudden, our own UUA leadership is going, oh, can we just go back to Pharaoh? We don't have to worry about all this stuff anymore. I mean, we were making some progress. Yeah, because going through it is hard. Doing that hard work of really, really being an inclusive community. There's a lot of struggle that's got to go on there first. This past week, I was asked to be on a district leadership team for the UU Ministers Association. Now look at me. Straight old white guy was asked to be one of the leaders of the district by another, get this, straight old white guy. My response to him was, given the current situation we're in, and the fact that there are ministers of color and women ministers in our district who are both younger than me and very capable, and probably have more energy than I do, never mind anything else, why don't we ask them first? It's not going to look real good if in our current denominational situation, a straight white guy asks another old straight white guy to be the leader. Right? The easy response is go back to Pharaoh. Oh, thank you, Reverend so-and-so. I'd be happy. I'm very honored. Everybody's thinking of me that way. Then my first reaction was, oh boy, I'm not going there. Back to Pharaoh would have been easier, but I had to make some follow-up phone calls. Like, I'm doing the right thing here, right? Huh? Right? This is okay. Like, yeah, if you don't get anybody else, yeah, call me back. But it's hard. Every little interaction we have like this is an instance we can go back to Pharaoh or actually practice a new, harder way. If the denomination goes back to Pharaoh when the going gets rough in the desert, is it any wonder the denomination hears so many stories of congregations having a hard time when the congregation gets in the desert? if the denomination is going to model for us going back to Pharaoh when the going gets rough, how can they expect the congregations they're trying to help to forge ahead into the wilderness towards the promised land instead of going back to Pharaoh themselves? When various issues, struggles, and challenges face the congregation. The denomination has to get real before they can be of real help to us here in the congregation. And we need them to do that. Like the ancient Israelites, we forget whenever we think we are going to die in a desert place. We forget that on the other side, the end of the journey, is the promised land. The land flowing with milk and honey. And part of the reason for this liberation, this personal, organizational, congregational, cultural, political, socioeconomic liberation is so difficult, so hard to put our focus on the promised land, keep the eyes on the prize, is that we have ingrained in us that the only way to get there is somehow through a violent struggle. We are only free of things that hurt us and hold us down and discriminate against us through violence. We must come back to things holding us down through physical, emotional, spiritual violence. If it's not painful or even deadly a struggle, we won't and can't succeed. And that's a fascinating framework to take a look at it from. That this is embedded even in our religious culture. Yes, the Exodus came out of Egypt, but it took the death of every firstborn thing, right? And Reverend Nakamisha Brock reminds us in the whole history of Christianity, the freedom or salvation is achieved by a guy getting tortured, and then forcing others to accept the religion of this guy getting tortured, literally at, sword and gunpoint and bomb point. So part of the reason we find it difficult to press through the desert into the liberation is the struggle gets weary because we think it always has to be a violent one somehow, either physically or through word or deed or emotion. The idea that true salvation, true liberation, real growth and healing must be, if it's going to last, without violence, is an idea that in reality is really still in its infancy in wider human culture. Nonviolence in spirit, in emotion, in relationship, in relationships between countries and tribes, is actually a viable option. And it is only in very recent history that we've even had some of us start to consider it as an honest to real God alternative that might actually work if we really wanted to try it. And it's much harder than the violent solutions we've inherited. And so, once again, we tend to go back to Pharaoh. But we've got to bomb Syria. Do we? But I've got to hold a hard line against this person I'm having an argument with. But I've got to beat myself up for forgetting to go to the gym yesterday. And we do the emotional beating of ourselves up, right? And it hampers our liberation and our salvation at every level. The solution is to do what the Jewish people taught us to do. To tell the story. And retell the story. Our story, our congregation's story, our country's story. Passover is celebrated by retelling the story of the Exodus. The entire story is told. The ceremony for the ritual is called the Haggadah, literally the telling, as they tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And the retelling of Exodus each year is how the Jewish people remember where they came from and who they are. But what if they had stopped? What if in their own story they went back to Pharaoh? And Moses and Aaron were out of here, we're going back to the bread and slavery. See ya, have fun up here. If they stop at that point and they go back, we don't have the retelling every year of the story as it ended up. The Jewish story at that point, if they go back, it would have still included Noah and the rainbow and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel and Joseph. They would have had all that still. But they would not have had the story of liberation, that it's possible to reach the promised land. Because they would have quit before they got there. But now when they retell the story, that part's in. And that part of the story has been used by people seeking all kinds of liberation and salvation ever since the story was first told. They had the guts to push on, to not go back to Pharaoh. They had the guts to struggle, and argue with each other, and snipe at their leaders, and take one step again towards the promised land. They had the courage to add to their story, to go from where they didn't want to be, in bondage and slavery and oppression, to where they did want to be, the promised land. And when they finally made it, they didn't forget about the rest of the story. They still told the story of Noah and the matriarchs and the patriarchs. But what they did then is they added to it. They added the story of liberation. They added the new chapters that made all the rest of the new chapters possible. And now, the telling of the Haggadah is a reminder that whatever our personal or congregational or cultural or denominational needs, whatever we need for our continuing growth, healing, wholeness, happiness, liberation, and salvation, whatever we need for it is always possible. There's always a new chapter waiting to be written, a new and next promised land to be reached, as long as we are brave enough and trust each other enough to not go back to Pharaoh, to not go back to the false promises and fake safety of slavery in Egypt, but to be brave enough to take one more step at a time into the promised land.